So for a few years after World War II, the Cold War was, well, cold. It was mostly a war of words, a lot of tension, but no real fighting. That all changed in 1948, right in the heart of a defeated Germany. Things were about to get very, very real. We're talking about a high-stakes showdown that pushed the world right to the edge of another world war. So let's dive into this critical moment, the Berlin Blockade.
I mean, that sounds crazy, right? How on earth could just printing new money almost kick off World War III? But that's literally what happened. The trigger for this whole crisis, a showdown between superpowers that put millions of lives on the line, was a new currency. So, how did we get here? Let's unpack it.
Okay, so to really get the Berlin Blockade, you have to rewind a bit. We've got to go back to the end of World War II, because the root of the whole problem was right there, in what to do with a defeated Germany. The Allies, the USA, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, they'd won the war together, but when it came to the future, they had completely different playbooks.
And these weren't just small disagreements. We're talking about two totally opposite visions for Germany's future. On one hand, you have the West, led by the US. They looked at a starving, broken Germany and thought, this is perfect recruiting ground for communism. So their plan switched. They wanted to rebuild Germany, make it economically strong, a real ally. And then you have Stalin. The Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany twice in 30 years. For him, it was simple. Keep Germany weak, strip its factories, make sure it's an agricultural country, and guarantee it could never, ever be a threat again. Total opposites.
And look, this wasn't just talk. The West started making moves. They took their 3 occupation zones, the American, British, and French ones, and essentially smashed them together into one big economic zone. They called it Bizonia. Now, put yourself in Stalin's shoes. You look over and see this happening. It looks like they're building a brand new, strong, capitalist Germany right on your border. For him, this was a massive red flag. The first domino had just fallen.
And Stalin's reaction? It was huge. It was dramatic. And honestly, it was an incredibly risky gamble to try and force the West to back down.
And here it is. In June of 1948, Stalin makes his move. He cuts everything. Every road, every railway, every canal going into West Berlin, blocked. You have to remember, West Berlin was like this little island of democracy and capitalism deep inside the Soviet-controlled part of Germany. Suddenly, 2 million people were trapped. No food, no fuel for the winter, no medicine. Stalin's plan was brutal and simple. He was going to starve the city until the West just gave up and left.
I mean, this was a huge move, a massive escalation. So the question is, why? What was Stalin thinking? What made him willing to risk an actual war over this?
Well, it was a mix of a few things, really. A lot of it came down to fear. You see, for the Soviets, the idea of a strong Germany was genuinely terrifying. But it was also about appearances. Having this bright, prosperous, capitalist city, West Berlin, smack in the middle of his communist territory, it was just embarrassing. It made communism look bad. And that new currency we talked about, he saw that as the final straw, a clear sign the West was building an enemy state. He wanted them gone, period.
So Stalin thought he had them cornered. He figured the West would protest, but ultimately they'd have to pack up and leave Berlin. He could not have been more wrong. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it was one of the most amazing logistical operations in human history. They called it the Berlin Airlift.
And this quote from President Truman says it all. For the West, this was way bigger than just one city. It was a test of their whole strategy for dealing with the Soviets, a policy they called containment. The idea was to stop communism from spreading. If they let Stalin win in Berlin, they thought, what's to stop him from trying the same thing somewhere else? So they decided to call his bluff. But not with an army, with planes.
The numbers here are just mind-blowing. Let's just let this sink in. 275,000 flights. That's over 10 months. We're talking planes in the sky around the clock, day and night, good weather, bad weather, it didn't matter. The sky above Berlin was constantly full.
And what were they carrying? 1.5 million tons of supplies. That's everything a city of 2 million people needs to survive. We're talking food, of course, like flour and dried milk. But also, think bigger. They flew in coal. Massive amounts of coal, piece by piece, to keep the lights on and heat people's homes through a brutal German winter.
And this is the stat that always gets me.
At the height of the airlift, a plane was landing in Berlin every 3 minutes. 3 minutes! The coordination had to be absolutely perfect. It was this non-stop conveyor belt in the sky, a lifeline of defiance. And the whole time, everyone knew that Stalin could just order his fighter jets to shoot them down. One order, and it's World War III. But he never gave it.
So, after almost a full year of this, Stalin had to face facts. The West wasn't backing down. The airlift was working. It was a massive PR win for the West. They looked like heroes. And a deeply embarrassing public failure for him. So, in May 1949, the Soviets quietly lifted the blockade. The roads and rails were opened again.
Okay, the crisis itself is over, but now we get to the really important part, especially if you're studying this for history. The big debate. Was what Stalin did an aggressive move to expand his power, or was it a defensive move because he felt threatened? This is a classic exam question, so let's get into it.
All right, let's look at both sides. The argument that it was a defensive move goes like this. Hey, the West moved first, right? They were the ones who combined their zones and brought in a new currency. From Stalin's perspective, they were the aggressors building up a potential enemy, so he was just reacting to protect his own interests. Now, the argument that it was an aggressive move is also really strong. You could argue Stalin wasn't just reacting, he was using the currency as an excuse. His real goal was to kick the Western powers out of Berlin for good and take over the whole city. As with a lot of history, the real answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. So the blockade ends, but its impact? Oh, it was just getting started. The consequences of this showdown would literally draw the map of the Cold War for the next 40 years.
It really was like a chain of dominoes falling. First, the blockade ends. Almost immediately after, Germany is officially split. You get West Germany, the Federal Republic, and East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. Then, the West is so spooked by the blockade they decide they need a formal military alliance. And so, NATO is born, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The basic idea is an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Of course, the Soviet Union sees this and a few years later creates its own version, the Warsaw Pact. And just like that, Europe is divided into two armed camps.
So what's the big picture here? What's the legacy? Well, the blockade pretty much set the Cold War in stone. Berlin became the #1 symbol of the whole East-West struggle. The division of Germany wasn't temporary anymore. It was a hard reality. And maybe most importantly, it taught both superpowers a very dangerous lesson, that you could go right up to the very brink of war, and the other side might just back down. This brinkmanship became a terrifying theme for the next 4 decades.
And that's really the big question I want to leave you with. Think about it. Not a single shot was fired during this entire year-long crisis. In that sense, it was a peaceful victory. But by creating 2 Germanys and 2 massive opposing military alliances, was this the moment the Cold War went from being a tense rivalry to something irreversible? Was this the point of no return?